Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison, and I want to welcome you to day 252 of Humanity Rising. Today, we want to strike the theme of public health, mental health, public health literacy. And as it happened, I looked at an article yesterday on the National Geographic website. And it was about a phenomenon in Japan that made me acutely aware of the importance of mental health and public health. There's a phenomenon called the hikikomori, which are young men in their 20s and 30s mostly, overwhelmingly men, who simply can't cope with life and shut themselves into their rooms and don't come out. They're largely supported by family that are concerned, who don't know quite what to do with it. In 2016, the Japanese government estimated that there were probably 540,000 of these hikikomori men in Japan, although the estimates are there's probably double that number, probably closer to over 1 million. The phenomenon has been accentuated during the last year of the pandemic. And it's deeply sad that in a bustling culture such as Japan, there are 1 million young men that we at least know about that have just essentially dropped out. There's also a response. One of the things that's happening is that there are now several organizations that pay young women to be what they call rental sisters. They start to write to the young men. They inquire how they are, and they begin to become pen pals, and they support them in developing their self-esteem. And then they start to exchange photos, and there may even be a visit. And the purpose, obviously, is to begin human interaction at a very basic way, a fraternal way, so that these young men can recover their sense of identity and their sense of purpose relationally in a situation of acute duress. So as we start our session today, let us be mindful of the acute needs that many people have around the world for just simple human contact. And that is at the heart of public health. Relational health is at the core of our immune system, our physical health, our mental health, our psycho-emotional health. So I want to welcome all of you into the relational matrix now of Humanity Rising. And let us begin, as we always do, by just taking a minute or two and coming into relationship with your body. Just feel your body for a moment. Take a few deep breaths. Close your eyes if you can and place your attention on your heartbeat. Listen to your heartbeat in a spirit of gratitude and thanksgiving that you're alive. And think of someone you love. Feel love through your heart. Thank you, everyone. Now, with an open heart and a heart full of gratitude and love for each and every one of you joining our session today, I want to welcome back Lars Munter, who represents the Nordic Health 2030 movement, and David Somek, who's involved with the Europe Health Futures Forum. They have convened so far 5 sessions on public health and mental health during our time of COVID that was so well received that we're initiating another program. So today is the first of 5 programs that we're going to be doing over the next couple of months. So David, Lars, thank you so much for all you've done. And I turn the program over to you.
Thank you so much, Jim. With now a wonderful few minutes where you made sure we were all grounded, David and I will do our best to create uplift if we can. And welcome all to this second series of 5 where we focus on public health again. Those of you that participated in the first series of 5 will have known that we fought our way through 5 really cool tasting menus, allowing you to get a feel for a lot of different elements that we work with in the European Health Futures Forum or in the Nordic Health 2030 movement. We'll try to go into a more slow food approach in this second series. Today, talking about health literacy. Next week, May 27th, we'll be talking about the European Health Union political responses to the pandemic or to public health in general, using the European Health Union as a case for that. The following week, we'll be diving into digital health and how digital support tools might also help individuals and community in creating a better health situation for them. And June 10th, we'll do more or less the same, if you will, for mental health. Also talking about mental illness, which is sometimes forgotten. And finally, for our 5th session in this series, we'll talk about diversity and how system transformation sometimes can either work with or against that diversity and those vulnerable groups out there that we've sadly seen in the pandemic being struck hard by an infectious disease and by sometimes the system. So the overarching goal for these 5 this time is challenging the model. And today, as David will talk about and will introduce in just a few seconds, we'll talk about health literacy and how that can also help challenge the model. And we'll hope you'll join us today and then following the following 4 Thursdays, but including this one as well, of course. So David, we're talking about health literacy today.
Yeah, Lars, thanks very much for that overarching view. I think what I would say about that is really the topics we've chosen are areas which illustrate how things can be levers for change in important areas. Some of you may have joined us for the previous set of sessions. In one of them, we looked at the future of European healthcare using a scenario type model, the 3 horizons. And we were ourselves very surprised with some of the results from the systems we teased out of the data we got from a bunch of people. Which illustrated that there were 2 very significant factors in the possibility of transforming the health ecosystem from where it is now, which is in a bit of a mess, to where we would hope it might be. Now, one of those was community engagement. That was very significant, and it's something I'm sure people who are viewing today will recognize, that people coming together and working at grassroots could be very important for societal change. In a way, it's kind of obvious, but making it happen is something else. One of the other major levers for change was health literacy. Now, we have some very skilled people who are going to talk to you about that and explain it to you much better than I possibly could. And we're going to start, let me just review the team, if you like. So we have Christine Sorensen from Denmark, who I always talk about as being the queen of health literacy in Europe. I'm sure she'll laugh at that, but she's also, of course, internationally based. And she'll explain something about what it is and its ability to help transform things. Then we go, if you like, to a case study, but someone who's done something very innovative indeed. Michelle Ashen has been working in South Africa, showing how in very difficult kinds of circumstances that we find as privileged people in Western Europe find ourselves, that you can do something very important by fostering health literacy. And finally, we have a different take on it from Marion Burstall from the Johnson & Johnson Foundation, who has also had a lot of experience in the third world, fostering change, but now is very keen to bring those ideas to Western Europe and look at how community action can also bring about those kinds of transformation. So let's start with Christine. I don't really need to say anything more about her other than please listen to the expert.
Thank you so much for this kind introduction, Lars, Jim, and David. And also, I'm very pleased to hear that Marianne and Michelle are here. They are two wonderful women whom I've met on my journey on health literacy, and I'm very pleased that we can have an interesting discussion today on the transformative power of health literacy. So when I started my journey on health literacy 10 years ago, I didn't really know what it was, and therefore started to dive into it. And the quest was, what is health literacy and how can it be manifested in Europe? And what's the level of health literacy of people? And the journey took me into the scientific literature. It also meant that I was speaking with many different people around the world. And we saw that, of course, it has two components, health and literacy. And starting with health, from a public health perspective, and I have a public health background, we often talk about health as in a medical perspective. But we, of course, know it's much more than that. It's the physical aspect, social aspect, mental aspect, spiritual, sexual, financial perspective that influences our lives. So as people living our daily routines, when you ask people on their deathbed, what is health to you and what is a healthy life, what can you recommend? They would say, keep your friends, have good relationships, get a job where you can earn enough to feel safe, help you, to spend time with your family, things that makes us happy and develop ourselves and make us thrive. However, in coming from the public health perspective, we talk about healthcare, disease prevention, health promotion, not at all the same language as we do when we are, ourselves and beings, human beings. So there is a mismatch there we could look at. When we have the other part of health literacy, and you dive into the dictionary, it says it's abilities to read and write, but it could also be in its widest sense about being able to manage, to organize, to have the knowledge to cope, the abilities, the skills, the competencies to live a good life. So you have this wide view on health and a wide view on literacy from a theoretical point of view. But from a practical point of view, we often see that health literacy is then translated into a more narrow perspective when we look at system level. And I want to challenge this. This was the quest today for this session. How do we change the model? Health literacies can be seen as now a new perspective, moving away from more old school health education. Health education, which was needed indeed decades ago when we wanted to combat hygiene. It was an approach that we are not combating hygiene, but infections with hygiene. And it was very much top-down approach. We know what is best for you. We are now moving to a new scenario where it's about people-centered health. It's about recognizing the assets that everyone has to take decisions on their own behalf if they have the health literacy to do so, or the literacy and the skills. So health literacy is not about being compliant or adherent to certain regimes. It's really about having the basic knowledge to form decisions, being able to interact with society around you, whether it's the family, your community, the system, decision makers, having the critical health literacy to also question what is best for me, for my community, for my country, for the global society. It's about being able to challenge also the status quo if that's not the right solution. And I think this is why health literacy is being mentioned as the transformative power to move us from a very medical oriented model right now, where it's about fixing and repairing smaller parts, to a more holistic approach to health literacy, indeed capturing all these dimensions that I mentioned in the beginning. When I prepared for this talk today, I was stumbling about the word dialogue, and dialogue is a mechanism I think we could enhance much more. Being able to explain our needs and concerns, but also being able to listen to each other at systemic level. Dialogue means flow of meaning in Greek, apparently. And the flow of meaning, I think, is essential for us to use health literacy as a lever for a better system and a better world. It's also the flow of meaning that sometimes is being disrupted now with the pandemic and the infodemic, that where we see that there are coming up bubbles or echo chambers where a flow of meaning is circulating in its own room and not really in a free world where the meaning is also being challenged. And there is a danger that we can be in an echo chamber where we confirm each other's meaning and we are with like-minded. Even in a community like this we are in now, we might be, confirming each other's beliefs, whereas sometimes it's also healthy to be challenged or challenge the status quo. And health literacy will make us empowered to do so in a way where we can build on our assets. But we also see that there are disruptive powers that are not necessarily wanting the best for us. It can be the commercial determinants, it could be the infodemic, where there is fake news appearing, and we need those skills that makes us able to judge what is really right and healthy for us at a certain time and a certain approach. So importantly for me to finish off here, my take on it today is that it's two-sided. On one hand, we should invest in people's opportunities and challenges and knowledge and skills and competencies to steer our own lives, be empowered to create a good life for ourselves and our loved ones through having a good job, taking good choices for our mental and social and physical and spiritual and so on well-being. On the other hand, we also should focus on the skills and abilities of our systems to design the good conditions for health and well-being. It's not an individual responsibility on its own. It's very much also a broad societal responsibility. And I know we are part of that same continuum. But I know today that you will hear examples from Michelle Ashen and Marin Bernstill on how this can be done and how health literacy can be a transformative power on changing individuals, but also societies. So over to you, Lars, for the next session, or David.
Well, both
the next session involves is challenging you, Christine. Yeah, that's what you asked us to do. Do you want to start, Lars?
Well, we might also include one of the questions in the chat here. And the question here is the role of big pharma in health illiteracy. It, of course, might be a sort of controversial issue, but how well we have the notion of the commercial determinants. Essentially, of course, health literacy is not just built by an educational system, as you just said. It's built by a lot of different stakeholders. How do we introduce, I suppose, most of the commercial sector in many ways to play a positive role in this?
Mm-hmm. I think here we also see a changing world. Some years ago, it was really a political decision, and health was very much determined by political decision, and it still is. But they are not in charge of the solutions. The solutions are commercialized, vaccines are commercialized, the tech companies that are running the whole communication systems are often commercialized. So they are on one hand our partners and very important pillars in our society. But of course, these can also be, everything can be misused, but you see that from politicians as well. So back to my word of dialogue, the dialogue I've had with some major pharmaceutical companies in recent years is that they know that they have to change. They have to be transparent too about how are medicines developed, what kind of content is it, how does it influence people's lives. They involve patients in the developments, and they realized, learning about health literacy, that the people they had in their test panels were often the most literate people, not those who had maybe lower levels. So they realized they had to change and transform their ways of work. And of course, this is one example I work with, but they said also internally, they had to walk the talk and have those challenging dialogues with the legal departments who wanted all kind of very technical information into the medical packages, but they also needed to design these informations in ways that people can actually understand. Otherwise, we had gone nowhere. So I see them on one hand as partners, but also, of course, again, we have to have our critical health literacy to challenge all commercial players to play the right game and not do harm.
David, a question from you.
Yes, there's a comment in the chat about politics, and of course I think we're acutely conscious that political decision making often cuts across what we might see from the health and healthcare angle as being what might be best for people. Now, there's a certain necessity that might be, that other people are elected to decide what the common good is, although obviously allegedly in a democracy we can challenge that. But the real issue is, of course, it's something you didn't mention, Christine, although I know you're very keen on this, but of course health literacy isn't just about educating citizens. There's a big area about educating professionals, which I'm sure you could say a few words about. Of course, that then extends to, okay, we can do something about training professionals, but how do we train politicians to understand things?
Yeah, that would be great. And I look forward to the research we can do after the pandemic to show which countries did best, because very clearly there are signs that countries that have very populistic politicians seem to do worse than others who have systems where you really want to invest and develop preparedness systems to protect your citizens. So yes, on one hand, we have an influence on the people that we elect, but often also people rely on people who are have a strong voice and promise everything good in the world, which might not be true. So it's interesting to see this balance between, on one hand, we want to empower people to take their own decisions. On the other hand, they sometimes delegate the power to people who may not always want the best for them. So I think that is a concern we should bring with us when we design our new model. But it's also which factors are important. Is it money? Is it power? What makes you thrive? So which agendas are we fueling? I do believe that the new generation's focus on planetary health and One Health will challenge the old generations, the dinosaurs, let's say, to question: is this the right track we are on? What is needed to change?
Interesting, Christine. And while David is busy in the chat encouraging drinking, I would point to the article shared earlier also by Eva Turk as a very interesting article to dive into the resilience of health system. A good question, I think, that connects two of the comments from Gareth and Karen would about changing systems. And one is about the educational system. How specifically, I guess, Christine, if you could, would you say that how to change educational systems for ourselves? This is simply a topic on the sort of on the agenda to have a weekly day of understanding health. What's the change here?
I definitely think we need to change our whole approach to health and education. In many countries, health is an add-on. It's project-based. It's not a sustainable way of teaching. You rely very much on the individual teacher to provide input on this topic. I would rather see that we take a much more profound approach for health as a human right that every person should know about and be able to protect as an asset. We do know that in some countries there is, for example, mental health or mindfulness on the topic. Physical education has been the key way of investing in health for many years. But as I said in the very beginning, it's much more than that. So a more holistic and profound approach, which is built in to health education or health systems and educational systems, will I think change the health of populations at large scale.
Really good.
Christine, I wanted to ask you a bit more about that though, because I suppose I don't know whether it's in our remit, is it? But this is about investment, isn't it? I mean, I thought you made a really terrific point about the notion of what public health was seen as and what we now think about it as. But that's a slow process to actually make happen, isn't it? There's still a lot of people. I've told this anecdote before. I was in a public meeting with citizens, just really, it was a kind of open talk shop. And I was talking about health literacy, and the audience initially was furious, and they were furious because they said, oh, well, yes, health literacy, that's something, this is typical public health speak, where you talk down to us and tell us what's good for us, and I had an enjoyable argument saying, no, it isn't. This is about you taking care of yourselves, but they were making a fair point, which was this is how they perceive the information being shared with them, and that has to change, doesn't it?
Unfortunately, that word literacy triggers something, and we might want to change it. It is a very academic term, and it's actually very difficult to translate into other languages, and therefore in other languages it's often called health skills or health competencies. And I think what I try to focus on is really the ability to act, and it comes down to, do we want to be victims in our own lives due to the stress and complexity of the world, or do we want to be warriors, meaning that we are actually able to be proactive? We are able to change our destinies. We are able to shape our lives, our communities, our societies. And for me, yes, you can interpret health literacy as, being about information and understanding it. But to me, it's much more than that. It is really a life skill that we should all have. And I do see it as a human rights issue, basically.
It touches upon another burning platform, maybe then. It is not because we do not have access to information these days. We have an abundance of information. And yet we see people, even though they have all this abundance of information readily available, turning their back on some of that information. And as the chat would say, we have the case in point of people choosing not to be vaccinated. Even though the pile of evidence that suggests that they should is higher than Mount Everest. So some have coined that as the infodemic, being bombarded with so much information that people choose to go their distinct other path. How can we better sort of grapple that infodemic? Christine?
I think we have to be honest and say that the pandemic is a very complex thing to manage and tackle and understand. It's also a moving target. It's something new. We didn't know what it was. Now we are gaining more and more insights that can help us navigate, and systems to navigate. But basically it's changing because new variations are coming of the virus, and the rollout plans don't match then the new challenge. And we basically built the planes while flying, and I can fully understand that this is very difficult to grasp for many people. Even the word epidemiologist, many people didn't know what it is. Now we know that these are the people, the experts that are talking to us from televisions every day, and all these facts and data matters to us, and the curves, the red and the green curves matter, how we deal with the pandemic. So complexity is one issue. The overload of information is completely understandable. And the authorities and the power that is embedded in those messages does also play a role. And you see that countries deal with the infodemic in different ways, also depending on how much trust there is built into societies. I know mostly the situation from Europe, and Lars and we are from Denmark. There's a high level of trust. And in France, speaking with Marion Bernstils from France, there is a lower level, and people are going on the streets and demonstrating and so on. I would say my country, if it's raining, we wouldn't go out and demonstrate, even though, you know, how important the topic is, because we believe people are there to help. So there are so many factors influencing, and unfortunately, there are also powers that really use or develop fake news and provide misinformation and disinformation that we need to tackle. And I am pleased to see that also the commercial stakeholders are now taking responsibility to match this challenge.
Christine, we've given you a tough time, deliberately, but we know you can deal with that. There's a lot more we could say, but we've got plenty of time later on in the dialogue with the others. Lars, would you like to introduce Michelle?
Yes, I definitely would. And thank you, Christine. The next speaker, Michelle Ashen, has built the Africans United as a way also of building health literacy from the ground up, and certainly not what we talked about earlier from top down. So without further ado, we have one that has certainly built the connection between the health literacy, between the building of community, and to turning the power of the community into a power for society as a whole. Michelle, please introduce us to your work and the way that you've used health literacy for good.
Thank you, Lars. Thank you, David, Christine, and Jim. It's so lovely to be here. And thank you for those who've dialed in and who've tuned in. I'm really excited about being in conversation with you all, much like we just listened to the conversation with Christine and Lars and David. But for me, health literacy it's not just a conversation, it's also something that's really close to my heart, because it's really an opportunity for Africa and developing countries around the world to empower and unlock its potential driven by communities of individuals. I think Candy made the comment in the chat about health literacy being self-empowerment. It actually is, right? Because if we look at the potential driven by communities of individuals who are well and able to create new realities for themselves and future generations, then it is a different world. You know, health literacy for me it's about building resilience in fragile healthcare systems that are stressed with scarce resources, harsh working environments, and actually that have been traumatized by their history and current reality, much like the country where I'm from, where Nelson Mandela fought for the freedom of so many South Africans. You know, my first experience with health literacy was when I was a brand manager for an American nutrition brand over a decade ago. And it actually forced me to learn about health and well-being and this term called salutogenesis, the idea that one should focus on factors that support human health and well-being as opposed to factors that cause disease, a pathogenesis approach. But it was actually here that I was privileged to be surrounded by nutritionists, dietitians, wellness, and medical experts who actually helped me to understand the powerful benefits of knowing the role of food and exercise and how it supports my mental health, my concentration, and even actually influence my creativity enough for me to be a value creator for those that I serve. I mean, who knew that in fact the body does keep the score of every action, every decision that we take, what we choose to put in our mouth, how much sleep we get, what physical and mental exercise we choose to do or not to do. And then for me, there's that subtle role that trauma plays in our ability to sustain and use what we know to maintain our health and well-being. Lars was mentioning earlier around the fact that there is so much information available, yet we don't necessarily make use of all of it. For me, despite being a personal effectiveness coach, that didn't actually save me from suffering from a really bad burnout. That took me on a journey of developing my own health literacy further, exploring our healthcare system, the economy, and my day job is in the insurance industry. I saw a chat there, and the link that all of these elements actually have together. But my time out in corporate served me well because it gave me time to learn and nurture my physical and mental well-being. And it also gave me the opportunity to explore how to also sustain my awakening. So being present and practicing mindfulness, Christine spoke about that earlier, right? The ability to be present moment to moment in everyday life as a means for me to manage my anxiety, my stress, and overall health in a proactive manner. And as I started to become more present, so less sleepwalking, I started to realize that learning about my health, my mental well-being, and the skill of mindfulness was actually a luxury that many on the African continent couldn't afford to learn, actually, much less have access to, which is why I started the nonprofit organization called Africans United. And we deliver self-development and health literacy education to disadvantaged individuals. And one of our partners, along with Christine, is a global learning organization called Insights. But being in conversation with Christine and a number of other experts, we're going on a really exciting journey, embarking and on a prototype and bringing health literacy to rural and urban communities so that we can actually decrease the pressure and the burden that's being placed on a very fragile healthcare system because we don't know any better. Health literacy for me in my experience is actually about de-risking economies. We're seeing that in the insurance space in South Africa, where insurance professionals actually have the highest rate of occupational stress, self-inflicted. So the idea there is using health literacy to decrease the burden on these fragile systems, right? De-risking economies, but also organizations and communities, so that we have the health to be able to navigate and create solutions for pressing problems, so that we actually don't just survive, but that actually we thrive in our everyday reality. In South Africa, we're predominantly a doctor-driven model. So we consult a general practitioner as opposed to going to a nurse to see to our primary healthcare needs. But because our healthcare system is so stressed because of the impacts of apartheid and our current experience of the pandemic, for the most part, trauma has actually left us quite numb and absent. So we live a life where self-destructive behaviors are actually the norm. We eat more fast food than fresh food, and learning about our health and well-being is not so much a priority, so much as actually surviving day to day with the money that we have for those who have jobs and access to government grants. Yet, we're a country that's rich, and across the continent as well, rich with land and natural resources. But we have yet to understand, much less the experience and the benefits of communities who are health literate. And here is really where we're seeing the international research act as a guiding light and a source of insight for us to start to question if what we're doing and what we've done has actually worked. Because we can no longer keep doing the same thing and expect a different outcome. And the pandemic has actually forced us to look at systems in a whole new way. And it's actually driven this inquiry, right? The system of our bodies, the system of our minds, the relationship between the two, and how together it engages with others and communities, as well as the system that is our economy, and then the organizations that actually enable so much of our livelihoods. Health literacy isn't a critical focus in organizations in South Africa. And for the most part, we are heavily dependent on scarce resources for the guidance we need. Building individual and community health literacy is an opportunity actually for us to put more slack in a stretched system, empowering individuals to live more happy and fulfilled lives, and actually for organizations to see that if the community is dead, the company is dead. So serving the health literacy needs of individuals is a real opportunity for us to challenge the status quo. And perhaps it's not so much about if we have a job and money, but where there is land and sand, what can we plant to nurture ourselves? Where are the seeds that need to be nurtured? And what are those seeds? And could it be that health literacy is a seed? And when nurtured, could it in return actually nurture economies on the African continent? And I believe that this could be very well be a pathway worth exploring, which is why we're embarking on this particular journey. In this next decade that requires transformation, as we head towards the 2030 agenda with the UN Sustainable Development Goals, what we've seen in the past is that doubt has been our biggest barrier to transformation. The doubt within ourselves to actually believe that transformation is in fact possible. And it does require an inner journey, the inner territory of leadership that change makers and those who are awake need to embark on daily. And health literacy includes silencing the voice of cynicism, doubt, fear, and hate, so that we allow for the possibility to emerge, the possibility that something so simple has the power to transform individuals and communities with the ownership to be in creation of their lives as opposed to being in reaction. Christine mentioned it earlier when she spoke about being a victim to one's life. And this is really my life's work, is to engage and be in conversation with individuals and communities that are winning the battle within their minds, that silence the doubt and embrace with courage the information that is out there, like Lars freely was saying earlier. It's freely available, right? Yet with some of us, or for some other reason, we don't do what we know, or when we know better, we don't do better. And it's a question I constantly ask myself and others on this journey. And I keep coming up against the subtle impact of trauma at an individual, intergenerational, and at a collective level. And it's perhaps one of the reasons why I don't hesitate in reaching out to others who are smarter than me, who've done the research, who have prototyped and tested and challenged new ways of being as a means to transform our current reality and to lead with health and well-being. My friend and thinking partner from Emory University is a nurse who served in Sierra Leone with the Ebola crisis. And he recently shared with me how the heart works. So I was super excited when I was listening to Jim do the resonance practice with us and just remind us just to take that breath in and to connect back to the heart. But with every single beat that the heart first takes, right? It takes freshly oxygenated blood with that breath that we take in from the lungs. And only then does it pump precious blood to the tips of the toes and then to the top of the head. And I share that because, think for a moment just how you function, much like the heart. A simple breath, a simple pause. But the heart, it feeds itself first before it feeds the rest of the body. And do we act like that every single day when we're in relationship with ourselves and with others? Do we act like the heart? So do we feed ourselves first before we feed and serve others? And here for me is the power of self-care, the power of health literacy, and the transformative power it has to be a pathway of change, resilience, and sustainability. And this is really the mission and the work of what we do at Africans United. What information, knowledge, and literacy do we consider essential in how we live our lives as change makers, as value creators, for a world that is in desperate need of more care and generative holding spaces, much like the one that's been created here today with Ubiquity and Humanity Rising? But just in closing, I just want to encourage each and every one of you to, what was commented earlier, to empower yourself with the knowledge, but also the embodied wisdom that you have what it takes to do what needs to be done, to create transformation, not only in your own life, but in the communities you serve, to feed yourself first and then to feed another. Because now more than ever, knowing how to take care of ourselves and doing that is critical in creating systems of well-being that have the fuel and the energy and the know-how to create a future that's different from the one we've come to know today. And that was me. So I don't want to take too much time, because I'm actually more keen to listen in and to participate in the conversation, and to ask the question and pose it back to you about, what this means for you and what you see is essential.
Michelle, help us though. You touched on the issue of trauma and feeding people, but the fact is that you live in a country where there's grinding poverty, where people don't have enough food to eat. How does one reach out to people in those circumstances? Because they, if you like, they have a very inevitably, because of the trauma of their everyday life, they have a very narrow bandwidth for listening to communications from others. It's only normal in those circumstances.
Spot on. So what we're seeing is a lot of people are leaving the cities, they're leaving the urban areas, and they're going back into the rural communities, because living in a shack on a small piece of ground in a tin structure is not sustainable. It just further perpetuates the trauma and a scarcity mindset. And what we are seeing is the cities are decreasing in size, and people are going back to the rural areas where there is a lot of land. And the conversations we're having is, what are you doing with that land? So they're going back to basics. They're planting spinach. It's now not so much about planting the spinach to sell it. It's about planting the spinach to eat it. And so we're certainly seeing a lot more of that, and trying to challenge those mindsets to remind people that even if you're living in an apartment, what we're also seeing is that people are taking big black bags, which are usually used for dirt, and we're growing herbs and veggies to actually sustain and feed ourselves, where money is a problem, because finding food, growing food, and being able to sustain one's health is becoming an increasing priority. But because we're so traumatized as a society, we tend to sit back with a hand like this, as opposed to, what can I do for myself? And so we're really just trying to marry those two together, because there are opportunities and there is ways to get around circumstance so that one can survive some of these heartbreaking challenges. And there's shoots of promise where communities and ecosystems are popping up, and we're holding spaces for individuals all over the place, particularly entrepreneurs, because they're the ones that are creating jobs right now. So whether it be in my day job or in a lot of the systems and communities I'm actively engaged in, there are beautiful examples of big communities that are cropping up. They're holding bursaries, they're hovering and developing boards and holding spaces around entrepreneurs. I'm going in there with health literacy and self-development. So the spirit of Ubuntu seems to be rising to the fore on the African continent, reminding people that I am because you are. So in some ways, while the pandemic has flattened the surface and really exposed the inequities, we've also seen the African spirit rise above some of these challenges for the better.
Wonderful. Okay, last, you want to have a last question?
One basic point that I've pondered sometimes, growing your own food. I mean, that is essentially something that requires a little bit of health literacy, especially because it often also leads to you cooking your own food and so on. Do you see sort of that connection with nature as also sort of a source of health literacy as well?
Yes, I mean, it goes back to the traditional healers and the indigenous ways of living. There is, as much as we talk about the health literacy and educating people about health and well-being, there exists already so much wisdom in the rural communities where there is already an embodied knowledge about how to grow the spinach and how to cook the spinach, and how to nurture the goat and how to slaughter it with respect. So, you know, on the African continent, we know so much already, that the international research and Western medicine and ways can really add value and complement what we're seeing in society today.
That's great as well. David, I think maybe it's time to introduce our, I wouldn't say last speaker, but at least our third.
I agree.
Today. We'll be coming back to both Christine and Michelle a little bit later, I think. Thank you so much for that insight, Michelle. Handling adversity as well is certainly also one element we should bear in mind here. Marion Burnstill, certainly, I guess, and I'm not pointing any fingers here, Marion. Where's your camera? Are you here?
She's on. Lars.
On,
Yes.
I'm here. Hello.
Yes, that's nice.
Why
Marion.
can't you see it?
That's very nice. Just making sure. And Marion, of course, representing the Johnson & Johnson Foundation. Yes, you have also worked in various places the foundation has at least. I'm not sure whether you have specifically in a various way a number of African countries, but your work on health literacy and how what the foundation does leads to more health literacy is what we're going to be hearing more about. I'm looking very much forward, Marion.
Lovely. Thank you so much to Christine, to Michelle, David, Lars, yourself, and for the invitation, for holding space for that conversation that's absolutely needed, and for holding space for the complexity, I think, of what we're talking about today. I guess an early disclaimer is I am no expert around health literacy, but through the years at the J&J Foundation, I'll take you a little bit today through how we've evolved our thinking, how our strategy has evolved, and now obviously with the momentum created through COVID-19, the momentum that we are feeling around health systems transformation, and the feeling of how do we go about challenging the current models, what are some of the ways that through our journey, and you've mentioned, Lars, some of my colleagues, some of them may be on the line, that are working across South Africa, Kenya, and various countries on community health. The strategy of the foundation, in fact, I'll describe it to you in the shape of an onion. As all complex system, I guess there's always different layers. But the first layer of the foundation and what we put out into the world as being our strategy is around supporting and championing people on the front line, specifically nurses, midwife, and community health workers. When we recently shifted our strategy, there was a realization that there is something about bridging the gap between community health and primary care. There is something of allowing, I guess, better health and sustaining good health as upstream as possible by investing into community health and community health systems. But I guess where we are getting at the core of the onion, it's really how do we rethink the goal and the purpose of the health system? How might we see an arrival point, which I think we all alluded to in some different shapes and form, an arrival point where health systems are they give privilege to prevention, to positive health, to resilience. In other words, health systems that are designed to sustain good health as opposed to curing bad health. And health systems that are more designed towards reaching out to people proactively as opposed to responding to diseases reactively. And health systems that are addressing the social determinants and that have that that have that ability to integrate social determinants, poverty, education, racial and social justice, and really integrating those key ingredients in the holistic response that one can give to citizens. And citizens is indeed health systems that are not that are creating pathways for citizens into health and well-being, and not just pathways for patients into cure and care. And there is that very beautiful metaphor that is used in a book called The Upstream Doctor. And it opens, I believe, the book with that beautiful metaphor of the waterfall. Two doctors at the bottom of a waterfall trying to save children from drowning at the bottom of the waterfall, until one of the doctor says to the other one, let me go up the waterfall and see what makes them fall into the waterfall. And I think that image is a beautiful metaphor for what community health may provide, and health literacy as well, allowing us to go more upstream and to respond earlier, to intercept, to be closer to people, to be more holistic in our model. So if today we're talking about how do we challenge the model, one means, in our view, is how do we hold space for three things. One is, how do we rethink system and the goal of the system? How do we hold dialogue? And I think that word came back from Christine and Michelle, and the concept of inquiry. How do we hold space for complexity that we're currently facing in the health system? And hold dialogue and co-create across different stakeholders within communities, and hold that space. And then thirdly is, how do we redesign and rethink pathways for change? So if I think through these three different concepts and the idea of challenging the model, one is systems thinking. And I think we alluded to different levels today. One is the individual level, where health literacy has an amazing space to empower indeed, and give individuals an opportunity to own and manage their own health to the best of their ability and capacity. And there's obviously at the individual level a lot that can be also unlocked through digital health. There are also limitations to some of these solutions, I guess, that can create sometimes more inequalities. That's where, in our view, one of the hypotheses is that community health comes at the middle ground between the individual level and the facility base, or what I refer to as the systems level. And that community health allows, through given structure and formalized structure, in many countries, community health system, as structure recruiting and recognizing community health workers at their core. This missing middle, where there is really an opportunity to be more holistic in the approach. But there's also a need, when we talk about systems thinking, there is also a need around systems leadership, and Christine alluded to it, is what have been some of the response to the pandemic, and how might we build more capacity around rethinking systems and being more equipped in tools and methodology to rethink health systems. There's definitely a very important concept here. And then if we remain in the systems thinking, and many people in the chat and outside alluded to it, it's what are the economic models that incentivize good health? We all know that currently the model is monetizing illness. How can we monetize resilience, and what might that look like in the future? So there's a space indeed that's needed around dialogue, inquiry, at different levels of, I guess, society, at different levels, of hierarchy, but also definitely holding dialogue and discussion at community level, understanding what the community assets are, what are some of the outcomes that the community would want to see, and how do we create new structures to allow for this bottom-up approach for communities to self-organize, to be empowered, to hold this conversation. So there is something around empowerment, there is something about humanizing health and not giving health over to the health system, but finding either at individual level or at community level a way to humanizing health again. And as you've understood from our perspective, and there is a lot to be learned from the Global South, where community health is one of the key instruments to achieving universal health coverage. And I can sense from the pandemic more and more, there are quite a few governments that have been looking at community health models and trying to understand what does that mean within our current setup? How disruptive would that be? In France, for example, pharmacists have become community health workers, if you want. They've expanded significantly their role and their duties and the scope of their work. But there is yet a lot to figure out across different countries who these community health workers are, and obviously recognizing and retributing them. So having those paid, not having those volunteering. Who they are, where do they operate? We talked about school, we talked about pharmacies. There's many different entry points to reach a community. So where do they sit? And lastly, how do they intervene? What's the scope of their work? How can they also be more agile in understanding the prevalence of disease of their community and adapting and being trained, having skills and competencies that reflect the need of their community? And obviously there is a need to rethink what that curriculum looks like. It's well adopted in several countries, but when we're talking about community health from a developed country's perspective, there's really a huge gap. Also understanding what's the return on investment around community health. I think in sub-Saharan Africa, $1 invested has proven to have a return of $10 of savings to the health system. And in the US, the figure is $1 invested, it's $2 saved. There's not that much information across Europe currently on return on investment of community health. So definitely a gap. And some of you alluded to mental health, which is also part of that resilience building. How might health intervention be more holistic, integrating and looking at obviously physical health, mental health, social isolation, financial literacy for some individual, employment. What might that integration look like so that we're approaching citizens not only on one of these facets, but across all of them, and almost understanding where are they, where are the assets from a resilience perspective, and also where are some of the drawbacks or the challenges that could be nurtured to improve their resilience. And at the end of the day, it is really mainly all about people. It's about those of us here on the line and beyond, understanding from an individual perspective, how might we challenge the status quo? How might we play a role and draw on our purpose to challenge the status quo and to bring our own contribution to the future and to that transformation? I am not sure how ready we collectively are to be radical in that change, but there's definitely opportunities to start testing some of these new models of care and new ways of approaching health that is indeed more resiliency based and more holistic. How might we invest in surfacing these new models, testing them, and also generating evidence around how do these models improve health outcomes? At the same time, how do they alleviate some of the burden on the formal health system? So that evidence is generated and evidence in hand, one can come to policymakers equipped with this evidence and really show across that continuum of individual, community, and health system, how might that come across? And my son is entering the room. I'm finishing in 5 minutes. You stay out. You stay out. You stay out. Apologies about that. That's the new normal. 4-year-old trying to juggle here. So a lot to be said around holding space for emergence and for testing and piloting and sense making about what we all want that transformation to look like and what could this model look like into the future, and not necessarily holding back on having quick wins right now. We all know we're coming out, and not yet coming out, but we've been firefighting a lot in the past couple of months. How might we hold more space for co-creating the future and discussing the collective vision that we all have for that future? And finally, obviously, representing a foundation, I guess we have some level of agility and risk-taking that others may not have. So how might the funding be more catalytic in proving the future, or in anticipating and testing and piloting that future? So that's why we were really working towards what are some of these community health models that could be brought across different countries and tested and proven, hopefully. And if they're failing, that's also a great outcome in themselves, in learning and iterating for change. So I'll stop here. Hopefully that gives already a roundup around challenging the model.
Marion, that's fantastic. It raises all sorts of questions, but I love that idea of commoditizing resilience as a challenge to the commoditizing of health. What I would comment on, just to throw into the pot, I mean, there's so many things we could take up. I'm sure Lars wants to as well before we move to the panel discussion, but just to share with you, we've been looking, my organization, with Lars as well, at things that are happening in Europe now. This is all about, you know, how you don't know what's happening next door and so on. But a dear friend of ours, in fact, part of our community, earlier this afternoon was giving an opening plenary thing, sorry, a keynote at a conference on living well. And he represented the Utrecht Health Pact. Utrecht is the 4th largest city in the Netherlands, and they have the most amazing community arrangement there, where each street has its own kind of approach to health, and they share it, and they're trying to, it's about a whole culture, isn't it? And I mean, you can be hopeful. I mean, the gym, giving that example of the pen pals writing to try and rescue the boys who'd locked themselves away. The spirit is there in the community, but it's about how to support it, to enhance it, isn't it?
Yeah, there are many of amazing examples out there. And I guess they're not nurtured to the right extent right now. And also, in some countries in Europe, at least, it becomes a political issue when we're talking about community health. In some countries, it can become quite politicized. And we're catching different terminology around that term. But you're right, we're working, for instance, with Mental Health UK, which is indeed piloting a community mental health navigators model. And they're really trying to allow severe mental health patients to be seen by a community mental health navigator that goes through this resilience tool that really tries to map out and understand beyond their mental health from a clinical standpoint, what might they need for their resilience to be nurtured, for them not to enter in crisis. The next step is, how can we take such a resilience to people that are at the brink of having a mental health problem, as opposed to severe mental health patients? So how can we be more in the prevention space by using the same tool? So there's many different approaches. Some of you may be familiar with the Burzog model, and I'm probably butchering the term and the way of pronouncing it.
Good enough.
But self-organizing team of nurses that are, for whom they have the mandate to shift from costing each intervention of wound care to really seeing what do patients need, what's the outcome that they need. And if it's a new pair of glasses, it may be what they're going to help the patient to achieve. So that's, you know, that mindset of moving away from monetizing illness and really looking at outcomes and at resilience. And there are attempts to monetize resilience. I think I saw a study a couple of years back that tried to put a value around resilience, but obviously it came out as quite artificial. There is a whole mindset shift for all of us to be had in how we value resilience, both at individual level, but in the broader system, at community level, and then the role that we all contribute into the broader system.
Well, monetizing, certainly an inspiring approach. You also, of course, mentioned the word nurture, and as Michelle used the word planting a seed. One of those elements that David spoke of earlier in the practices in Utrecht. I mean, the interesting fact here, the odd thing about this is not coincidental, and it's not something that happens by chance. In the city of Utrecht, it's the result of a long-term effort to build this. So without necessarily using the monetizing term, but the nurturing term, how do you, I guess, in the foundation, use those to nurture and plant seeds elsewhere of those same practices? But because it's not a coincidence, it's a matter of strategy.
It is a matter of strategy, and as you mentioned, I think we have a strong track record around community health across developing countries. And again, some of my colleagues are probably on the line here and are doing amazing work. And there's a lot of learning and obviously a lot of key stakeholders that are talking about what are some of the design principles around community health. How do you design a community health intervention or a community health system that is successful? There is a little bit of gap in understanding that from a developed countries perspective. So what we are currently doing to nurture the space, as you say, on systems leadership, we started working with the School for Systems Change around a base camp for health systems transformation, where we're equipping health leaders with systems, tools, and methodology and practice. We really try to empower them to move away from systems thinking to systems doing, and just go back to their own organization, implement systemic tools and systemic approaches. So that's one way, and that's one entry point. The other entry point is we're doing research with the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership, trying to understand the space of community health across several European countries. What are some of the pioneering practices? How might we try to have a typology of different community health, both from an entry point perspective, who is delivering the community health, how is it nurtured, what's the policy response? So really trying to bring some grounds under our feet and understanding the space much further. And then finally, we're working, and that's work in progress, not official yet, but we're working with an organization in how might we launch a big challenge in surfacing these pioneering practices and giving them more voice, share of voice, but most importantly, learning from each other, challenging each other, learning what works, what doesn't work, what are some of these in-depth design principles that they have come across, and what does nurturing resilience look like in different neighborhoods? As you say, in Utrecht would look differently in other countries or other cities. But at the core for us, there are a few principles. One is it needs to be grounded and centered around people that are paid, that are community health workers that are paid, that are trained, and recognized by the health system. So there's obviously a few limitations or boundaries that we're trying to put so that we're not creating parallel systems, but we are trying to push the system in a certain, nudge a system in a certain direction. The second criteria is also the flow of information between the community health intervention and the formal health system, so that there is interoperability of data, and that data is well integrated across the community health intervention and the facility-based intervention.
Integrated care.
Obviously work in progress around these criteria, but we're learning by doing and just accepting. We don't know, what the solution is, but we are trying to get and listen, and through inquiry learn where do we nurture, how do we nurture, and what do these practitioners actually need, those that do community health and have been innovating. What is it that they see as a watering can onto their head? And it may be funding, but it's not always a given that funding is the solution. Sometimes equipping them around systems change is also really a catalytic intervention. And some other times it may be exchanges with visionaries. How do you reconcile those innovators with visionaries, and how can you convene that conversation for change? So those are a few ways, I guess.
Sounds you're talking about education quite a bit. Can we bring in Christine and Michelle to the conversation? I'm sorry we've got so little time left. We've got a few minutes, and we'd love to hear your reaction, you guys, to what Marian's been saying, or to what each other have been saying. Would you like to say anything?
Also a nice metaphor here. We're talking about seeds and watering cans and grounding and so on. That's certainly very inspiring. Oh, sorry, too much of a dad joke perhaps, but there's certainly a lot to talk about. Children to intervene as well.
We love children to intervene.
Struggling with their cameras, perhaps. Well, but there was an interesting element, of course, that talking about communities, and we want things to grow and change, of course. One thing that is often very, very tricky in that sense is, of course, the housing that people are placed in. It plays a key role, to be sure, for their health, but it's not really something that they can just up and fix. Well, I mean, they can renovate, that's not the point. But it can be hard to suddenly just shift the entire housing element, and whether it's about ventilation, or about dampness, or perhaps mental health issues in terms of having too many people living too close together, or whatever. The housing element of it. We had Morten Nielsen of the International Federation for Housing and Planning. How perhaps also, and yes, homelessness is of course a problem for many as well. But how do you in the J&J Foundation think about the element of the overall housing planning issue, or perhaps urban planning for that matter? That would include the homeless too.
So currently, the way we've been operating is convening these ecosystems of change, really centering them around platforms, pulling in different actors within a given location. It's quite a hyper-local approach to change, I guess. If you're talking about, Kenya, for instance, there has been convening of both government and several organizations working together on this community health strategy. So that came at it from quite a financing perspective, and how does community health financing come into the picture, and reorganizing the way that financing is flowing in different localities. But obviously health is all encompassing, and the topics of employment, of housing, of financial literacy are key. And then the question is, as we all have some boundaries and some limitation as to how much we can chew, how do you convene broader ecosystem where you can be mutually reinforcing with other actors that are bringing in some, being foundation or not, but that are bringing in another layer or another element that is currently missing? And that's where we started to shift away from being funders for implementation to being funders for implementation and convening, so that we are actually allowing and giving space to some of our partners to become what we call backbone organization, that pull in different other actors into the conversation, so that collective vision is not too restricted, that it's obviously grounded in a strategy that's relevant to us, and yet has also more reach and can be more holistic in its nature. One of the biggest challenge in a lot of development work is the verticalization of the funding, the fact that we all want to fund what we want to fund, because that's what makes the world go round, that's the strategy of our organization. And how can we actually establish a foundational solution while we can only finance vertical answers? It's a lot about the financing and how might we convene broader governance and broader ecosystem that can go beyond just a slice of the problem, because that's what brought us here very often. I don't know if that makes sense, but I'm probably speaking in metaphor.
Surely makes sense, but also I guess from your viewpoint, Christine, and you, Michelle, a sort of the huge wish, or perhaps if you had, what would you really point to here? Marianne had some really good points here about what the verticality of it versus the holisticness. That's a struggle for sure. Christine?
I think we should move from horizontal to, from vertical to horizontal thinking. And that means also embracing health literacy among many other disciplines and sectors. I want to move us back from it being an individual choice in which house you live. It's much more profound than that. It's how we shape and design our societies. And I still don't get it. I live in a city with 50,000 people, or 500,000 people here, and the new blocks where I live, they are gray boxes, and we have so much knowledge about designing wonderful landscapes. So I just don't get that. Why are we still building gray, boring boxes that are not stimulating our health? And it goes back to, of course, the funding and the economic streams, that they are cheap, and probably someone will gain from it. But from my quality of life, from the people around us, why should we look at this when we have so much knowledge to design wonderful urban landscapes and creating conditions where people will live and thrive? So I think this is another issue where health literacy can inform and help us to speak up and actually question and challenge again the status quo. Is this really the cities we want, and now and in the future? And whether the funding come from private sources or public sources or the philanthropic sources, how should the landscape look like where we want to live now and in the future? So involving architects, funders, payers, banking, everyone needs to be on board. Thanks.
It's certainly far too easy to externalize certain costs when you build. Some of those costs end up in the hospitals. Well, not the costs, but the people. Michelle, a word from you too, please.
Sure, my closing comments. I think everybody's just said so much that's given us all food for thought, but I guess two things that stood out for me that Marianne was saying was, you don't always need money, right? It's not only just about the funding, that there are ways and means to get societies and communities and systems resilient and to get them to work, and for us to remember that. And just what all of you have been sharing, as well as Christine, around the fact that there is so much information out there that is available, that we can use to empower ourselves, so that really there is no excuse for us to be contributing to results that we don't want to see. We actually can do it the other way around, by contributing to results that we do want to see, by empowering ourselves. Thank you.
Beautifully, Michelle. A final word from you, David, before we allow Jim back on the floor?
I was only going to say it's wonderful, this conversation, and we wish it could go longer. But so thank you so much for Marianne, for Michelle, for Christine, for sharing with us what your thoughts. And there's so much we can take away. But I'm conscious that we're keeping Jim waiting, and he wants to introduce the next.
But see you next week. For a talk also about challenging the model, this time about political responses.
We hope to see you. Over to you, Jim.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Lars, Michelle, Christine, Marianne. Splendid session. I must say, Christine, your last point on how we impoverish ourselves by living in these little boxes. It's no wonder that, you know, over 1 million young Japanese men just don't want to deal with it, because the impoverishment of modernity is systemic. And I think that's one of the reasons why we're being laid waste by the scourge of COVID, because of the impoverishment of the soul. So I just want to acknowledge that point. And, you know, because that's one of the things I know David and Lars are trying to do with their work. What Humanity Rising is doing, all of you, is, you know, how do we revitalize the human spirit when everything possible is now available to us? We're simply choosing not to live abundantly at almost every level. I mean, you'd think of the Middle East, for example. They've been in perpetual war since the nation of Israel was founded back in the 1948. They could be getting together. Europe did it by creating the European Union, and yet they're condemning themselves generation after generation to impoverishment. And so I was just struck by that point, and it kind of cuts to the quick of who we are as human beings at this moment in history. And the other point that struck me was the point I think you made, Michelle, about the heart. You know, that the heart feeds itself first, and then it feeds the body. And in feeding the body, the blood comes back to the heart. And, you know, it goes back to what the sages from Confucius to Jesus to the Talmud to indigenous people have said, you know, you love your neighbor as yourself. And if we would only do that, our health literacy would jump exponentially at all levels. And I think, Marion, you made you gave the modern parlance to that, and that is systems thinking. If you think of systems thinking, it's taking yourself and others into common consideration for a wholeness that encompasses both. And I think that's at the heart of the kind of literacy that the world needs, because it's only from a systems point of view that we can take action around the point that I think all three of you made, and that is around developing resilience. You know, if you're isolated, you're not resilient, you're reactive. But if you're holding the whole and loving your neighbor as yourself, which is the most obvious thing in the world, resilience comes out of the interconnectivity of the parts. And so I've really been struck by this panel. David, Lars, you're knocking it out of the park, as we say over here, every time. And you've inspired all of us, I think, to think more carefully about our health literacy. The pandemic has certainly made that an issue. And you folks today have given us, I would say, the pathway and some of the considerations for making it more current in the way we live our lives and the way we cope with a pandemic that seems to be getting more intractable no matter what we're doing. And so there's some very deep lessons here that we have yet to learn, but when we do, I think the pandemic will naturally fall away. So I've really appreciated this session, and thank you. And Leslie Southwick Trask and Matt Robertson have created a group, a public health group on our Ubiverse. And maybe Leslie, if you can or Matt put the link in. And also we're doing something else, everyone. We're partnering with an Australian company called Mind Hive that convenes global conversations. And Leslie's working with Mind Hive and Lars and David to create a global discussion around the various issues that they're convening in the domain of public health. So what you can do if you want to join this conversation, you can go onto the Ubiverse, and we're going to try to globalize this with a major strategic partner, because we've taken the position, which is one of the reasons why we're having now the beginning of the next 5 sessions with Lars and David. Public health is up for the human race. It's just up. And we got to take it seriously. So thank you all. And then tomorrow, everyone, we're going to celebrate the first anniversary of Humanity Rising. We convened on May 22nd, 2020, in the depths of the pandemic. And here we find ourselves 252 sessions and a year later. So tomorrow, the 21st of May, Saturday's the 22nd, we're going to remember and celebrate humanity rising in all its dimensionality as it's happened through this group, which is comprised now of well over 10,000 people registering in over 130 countries from all over the world. We broadcast out to 15, 20, sometimes 30, 40,000 people every day. We've had over 900 speakers. We've launched at least a dozen initiatives with strategic partners from all over the world as a result of Humanity Rising. So tomorrow we're going to just take a little pause and reflect on what a year has wrought. So thank you, everyone. You're welcome to the after session chat group, and we'll see you here again tomorrow on Humanity Rising. Bye for now. Thank you, Lars. Thank you, David.